Hello, everyone. Professor Philip Travis. This week in United States history, we're going to begin a dive into America in the 1960s. The 1960s is a highly significant decade in American history, so we will be examining this over the next couple of weeks. The 1960s, in some respects, is a turning point in American history where you see a shift from, if you will, the New Deal liberal coalition, which had really been the overwhelming political paradigm in American history, certainly since the New Deal of the 1930s of Franklin Roosevelt, which was highly influenced, of course, by the Progressive era before it. It's in the 60s, though, particularly the late 60s, following the tumultuous year of 1968, which gave rise to the election of Richard Nixon, where you start to see the New Deal liberal coalition kind of fracture. And so in that way, it's kind of a turning point as the liberal faction with the old New Deal sort of liberal leadership, as that sort of has a divide with a group that would be considered the New Left, which was by no means an event isolated to the United States. You saw these political forces across Europe as well. As that happened, of course, the conservative movement unified. Libertarians, religious conservatives, and so forth sort of unified in the late 1960s around a number of issues. And we will be talking about this in subsequent weeks. But this made this a real turning point. It's here where you start to see the New Deal liberal sort of paradigm in governance in the United States begin to fracture and ultimately give rise to the emergence of the modern conservative paradigm, which is usually associated with taking full sort of reins of the paradigm in American governance with the election of Ronald Reagan. So it's a significant turning point. The 1960s, too, it's a period of time associated with a tremendous amount of tumultuous events, assassinations, of course, most tragically, or most well known, I shouldn't say most tragically, the assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963. Equally tragic, the assassination of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. And of course, also John F. Kennedy's brother, Bobby Kennedy, also assassinated in 1968. So it's a decade. There were some serious social protests in the United States, events like the Watts riots. There was massive amounts of clash and conflict over civil liberties and civil rights, as there were intense sort of acts of racial terrorism perpetrated across the United States against African Americans, particularly in the American South. Just to name a few examples of how tumultuous the 1960s was. This was a decade that eventually becomes remembered for the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War. And of course, this war becomes associated with widespread protest, the counterculture movement. So it's a very, very tumultuous decade. It's also a decade, interestingly, that brought a lot of really, really significant and lasting and positive reforms. Of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 ends, at least from a federal government standpoint, segregation in the United States, though many places across the American South refused to follow this decision until the early 1970s, when they were basically forced to in some cases. And of course, the long-term sort of resonance of residential segregation in the United States continued to be felt many, many years after this, and you could argue is still felt today in the 21st century. But a huge step forward legislatively, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Of course, huge steps with respect to women's rights, second wave feminism, as it's sometimes called, with the birth control pill, and eventually, by the early 1970s, achieving a federal protected right to choose with respects to reproductive rights, pregnancy, and abortion, which of course occurred with the now overturned Roe v. Wade decision. There was huge social steps as well in terms of social uplift and ending poverty, Medicare and Medicaid, to name a few, and we'll be getting into all of these and more. as we cover this. Now, in this particular section, I want to talk particularly about the Kennedy administration. The Kennedy administration, who really began the most significant steps from a federal government standpoint, on civil rights, following the widespread activism across the American South and the shocking events in Birmingham in 1963, which really, the grassroots activists led by individuals like Martin Luther King Jr., individuals like Bob Moses and Eller Baker, who were key organizers of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and they were associated with registering people to vote, particularly in the South, where Jim Crow laws had disenfranchised thousands of people of their constitutional right to vote. The grassroots activists in the civil rights movement really forced the United States government and the United States as a country to take the matter seriously. And prior to Kennedy's tragic assassination, Kennedy, of course, began to champion these important changes in civil rights, and Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, would take that mantle and carry it through following the assassination of Kennedy. John F. Kennedy's administration is interesting. It has a role in the sort of American memory that is somewhat controversial, but also somewhat romanticized. On the one hand, at the time, John F. Kennedy was seen as he won a very close election against Richard Nixon. And one of the reasons why he won the election was because of the televised debates that Nixon and Kennedy had in 1960, in which Nixon refused to wear the makeup, and Kennedy, in turn, looks like a movie star, and Nixon, not so much. Kennedy and Nixon, actually, really, in the height of the Cold War, they really didn't disagree that much on foreign policy issues, believe it or not. But Kennedy won a very, very thin election, very close margin in this election that Kennedy won. And Americans really perceived Kennedy almost like as a movie star family. John F. Kennedy, his wife Jackie, they had a very nice family. But of course, behind closed doors, of course, there are stories of which were not released at the time. There was a lot more sort of accepted behavior in the press to not report certain things in some cases. But so we ultimately know that behind closed doors there were extramarital affairs. We know also John F. Kennedy was not actually nearly as healthy as he may have seemed, suffering from Addison's disease, as well as severe pain from a back injury that he suffered in if you will, a backyard tackle football game. And so he had a great deal of pain from that injury, as well as having to deal with the issue of Addison's disease. John F. Kennedy, of course, was a decorated service member in World War II as well, a PT boat commander whose boat was sunk by a Japanese ship, and they were actually marooned for a period of time on an island. So during World War II. But John F. Kennedy as a president, sometimes John F. Kennedy is remembered for being the person that takes the first steps to bringing the United States into the Vietnam War, even though the Eisenhower administration began the Advisors Program and really began to prop up the Diem regime, No Dinh Diem, in Vietnam in the previous decade. Kennedy really expanded the Advisors Program. So some fault Kennedy for sort of taking the United States down the path in Vietnam. On the other hand, there are some scholars who insist that after the coup which overthrew Diem, the South Vietnamese leader, in 1963, and his subsequent assassination, that there were signs that the Kennedy administration was reconsidering its role in Vietnam. And of course, we'll never know whether or not he would have gone the course that Lyndon Johnson took following John F. Kennedy's assassination on November 22nd, 1963. We won't know that. Johnson certainly felt he was doing what Kennedy would have done. And both Kennedy and Johnson were listening to their advisors. You see here, of course, Kennedy's inauguration. And here you see Kennedy with Secretary of State Dean Rusk and his Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Both McNamara and Rusk were huge proponents of the United States' involvement in Vietnam at that time. And Rusk sort of remained a strong proponent, whereas over the years, by the time you get to 67 and 68, McNamara kind of soured on the conflict and is actually relieved of his duties by the Johnson administration. We'll talk more about that when we get to Johnson and the height of the Vietnam War. Kennedy, and I'll finish it with this, Kennedy as a presidential figure. So regardless of how one views some of the policy choices that Kennedy made, as a president, Kennedy's sort of outlook on how to lead as a president is probably one of the more desirable approaches to being a president. He's what political scientists call a high complexity thinker. And what that means, and it's contrasted with being a low complexity thinker, and it just so happens that Lyndon Johnson, his successor, was a low complexity thinker. Now, that doesn't mean that you should think John F. Kennedy's really smart and Lyndon Johnson's not, actually. It doesn't mean that. And actually, Lyndon Johnson made some great contributions to American society. Medicare and Medicaid being a couple of lasting examples of that, though the Vietnam War for many years really characterized, the failure in the Vietnam War really characterized Johnson, and perhaps unfairly, and historians have kind of reimagined that or reconsidered that. Reconsidered that. A high complexity thinker, what it means is that as a president, John F. Kennedy listens to his advisors, and he has a group of advisors that make up his National Security Council, sometimes called technocrats. And they're all very, very good advisors. He listens to them, and he makes what he thinks is the best decision. But a high complexity thinker really has the ability to sort of change their mind. So as they make a decision, if they see the decision as problematic or as an error, then they are more likely to be able to listen to other feedback and make a new, maybe more effective decision. A low complexity thinker, on the other hand, once they make a decision, they sort of dig their heels in on the decision, and then they expect support and loyalty from those on their team, making it more difficult for a low complexity thinker to sort of recalculate their position on things. John F. Kennedy is a high complexity thinker. A great example of this are two of his most significant sort of foreign policy events: the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Bay of Pigs occurs right when John F. Kennedy becomes president. Of course, the Bay of Pigs was an attempt orchestrated through the CIA, which trained Cuban insurgents to try to overthrow the regime of Fidel Castro just a few years after Castro had taken power. And of course, this plan was set forth during the Eisenhower administration. The plan becomes a failure. Kennedy was advised to go ahead with it. He goes ahead with it. As things escalate, there was a request for, U.S. to begin air support. He did not want the situation to escalate, and it becomes a real. It was a failure. It looked very bad at the beginning of Kennedy's first presidency. He kind of listened to the people that were really promoting the more aggressive approach. When the Cuban Missile Crisis came around, and this is actually, again, Kennedy with Rusk and McNamara, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. When the Cuban Missile Crisis came around, Kennedy used that experience from the Bay of Pigs, where he kind of listened to the first sort of advice on the matter. And in the second case, he sort of reevaluated how he considered that scenario and made a different decision. And the outcome was much, much more positive, one of the greatest sort of triumphs of his presidency as terms of foreign policy. So in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, as the crisis unfolded, which of course we know, this was when the United States learned through the surveillance of its U-2, high-tech U-2 spy plane, that the Soviet Union was stationing nuclear-capable missiles in Cuba. And of course, the United States, initially, the sort of head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military element within the National Security Council, advised Kennedy, to attack, advised more aggressive positions. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara advised instead that Kennedy might consider a blockade. And knowing his first experience with the advice on the more aggressive approach, Kennedy instead accepts the advice of McNamara, conducts a blockade. It's a highly, highly tense period that lasts almost 2 weeks, where many people in the United States and places like Florida thought that World War III might be on the horizon. The blockade was a wise decision and an example of a high complexity thinker sort of recalculating how they made a decision and making a more practical decision perhaps, or a more moderate decision, and the result was a very significant success in foreign policy. The fact, too, that John F. Kennedy was a high complexity thinker capable of sort of changing his mind was also a major reason that some scholars suggest that John F. Kennedy might have gone a different direction in Vietnam, as opposed to simply going the route that the United States does, where after the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem in South Vietnam, the United States could have either begun to extricate itself from Vietnam or it could begin to increase its involvement. And it increases its involvement without really having any plan of success, and thus begins the sort of descent into like a quagmire of a war, which it really, once it was in, it was very difficult to find a way to extricate yourself from it. Kennedy might have been able to make a different decision because of his nature of sort of listening. He was a consensus builder. He would listen to all the really smart people around the table in the National Security Council, and he would evaluate what everyone was saying and try to make a decision that was the best decision and represented a consensus, but he didn't lock himself into that decision. He would listen to other advice, and he might recalculate and reform his decision. So Kennedy's a high complex thinker in political science, and that's what I'd like everybody to kind of explain for the Extra Credit Factoid this week, and I'll see everyone this week in the discussion forum. Have a great week, and this is a long one. I'll give you a couple points for this. So thanks for bearing in with these long announcements.